Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we talk with faith leaders, practitioners, and academics at the intersection of faith, climate, and environmental justice. And this morning we have on a good friend of Gipple and myself, Susan Inman, who is the coast keeper for the Altamaha River Keeper. Susan, thanks for being here this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So before we get started, I want to remind everyone that we are currently taking registrations and promoting our Eco-Faith from Home, 30 Days of Climate Action between April 13th and May 13th. Put the link in the chat, but it is gipple.org/30 days. We'll have about 15 workshops going on rooted in the Drawdown Georgia framework and how congregations can take advantage of that and implement their climate solutions. So please definitely sign up. Susan, thanks again for being with us.
Yeah.
As we dive in, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's definitely not a straight line. I am originally from Minnesota, South Dakota area. That's where my family still lives. My accent is getting better. It's not as Minnesota strong, but it's still there. And especially around the holidays when I speak with my family, it gets to be pretty strong. But then, I went to college in South Dakota, and then I started moving around. I was in southwest part of Ohio, working on a master's there. And then I decided didn't quite really want to be an adult yet. And I had a job opportunity out in Utah. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's be in the mountains and, enjoy that lifestyle. So I was there for about a year and a half. And then when I was out there, I received an offer to work on the coast of Georgia. And I was just like, I don't know, but it was an island. And I didn't know there was islands in Georgia. I didn't know anything about it, but they were going to pay me and give me housing. And so I said, okay. So I packed up my car and I arrived in Georgia. And it was a pretty great way to be introduced to Georgia. It was to live on a barrier island. And it was actually St. Catharines.
Wow.
So it was a private island to boot. Take a boat to work every day. I felt like I was living the life, and it just kind of it hooked me from that point. But when I was moving around, I was a biologist, mainly focusing on birds. For a while, it was just raptors, but then it turned into exotic species, and that's where it all kind of came together on St. Catharines, is working with those types of animals. And then just, life just kind of changed, and I needed to move on to something different. I was growing, and so we're just something inside of me. And so I moved to the advocacy aspect to it, and just taking conservation to another level and trying to make a more of an immediate impact instead of just writing papers and saying, I suggest this, and then it usually gets folded up and put on a bookshelf, yeah. Which is good because you need those as an advocate, that type of science, but to actually have an impact with talking with legislators or your community members is where I'm at now, and that's what I really enjoy.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think that you have a reading to offer this morning, so I'll invite you to do that.
There's always so many things that inspire us, but one that probably a few years ago I read it, and it just really hit me, and I always have been going back to it since. And it's part of an essay from Toni Morrison called The Site of Memory, and it's the active imagination is bound up with memory. They straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it's not flooding, it's remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Riders are like that, remembering where we were, what valley we ran through, what banks we were, or what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It's an emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remembers, as well as how it appears. And a rush of imagination is our flooding. And when I read that, it's I always replace writers as me, as someone that enjoys the environment, as an advocate. It's just like this ever-changing experience that we have with nature. And so it completely feels every category of a person. And when I change it to writers, it always brings me back to a phrase about what is the difference between a scientist and the average citizen. The only difference is the scientist writes it down, you know? And that's what I think a lot of citizens forget, is that they know a lot more about their backyard than a lot of scientists. And that's kind of what drew me to Riverkeepers, is actually being a part of the neighborhood, but fighting for that neighborhood. So you know your neighborhood, you know the people in your community, but you can always learn more from those that you look to and you're trying to help protect.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so that kind of ties it all up for me. And yeah, I've been going back to it for a while.
Yeah, that water has perfect memory is pretty powerful.
Yeah, yeah, and you can take it as far too. You know, if you look at the Georgia coast, our history of it, and way back in our ancient history, we actually have sand dunes all the way up in Waycross. You know, those are sand dunes 40 miles away from our current coast. So, you know, we're experiencing sea level rising. So is the water remembering, you know, flooding these same places that it used to flood years ago? And so if you look at the geology, which is a history lesson, it's kind of going that direction again. So again, it's just opening up a past. The future is opening up the past.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into some of the current issues that you're working on now, but before we do that, I wanted to ask you if you'd also say a little bit about how your kind of spiritual experience and history kind of links into the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so my family, my mom's side of the family is from the Minnesota, South Dakota area, and my dad's side lives in Colorado. But I grew up with my mom's side, and they are a Polish community and a Polish Catholic community. You always have to say that those two words in southwest part of Minnesota. It's always been the root of our family. I, for whatever reason, I don't know, have never really had that strong draw to a church and that draw to be a part of it, but it is a part of my family. Like it is like part of my soul and how I was raised, and it's always there. And the really neat thing about my family is that when they first moved to the southwest part of Minnesota, they were one of 5 families that were first there, and their goal was to build a community. You know, they moved there with other families because of that. But to have a true community, they felt they needed a church. But again, it's a Catholic church. You just don't build Catholic churches, especially back in 1800s or mid to late 1800s. Like you just don't do that. So what you have to do is they had to write to the Vatican a petition to build a church, the need for it, that they're building a community, and to expand the word of God. And they didn't really know what was going to happen because they just moved to this new area, but they got the permission and they ended up building a church in the late 1800s. It's still there.
Very cool.
And it's beautiful. It's a large cathedral. It has stained glass windows, and it's definitely built in an area that has kind of outgrown what their vision was. So it's not a part of a community anymore, but it's in the middle of farmland, and people still use it today. They actually trade weekends or Sundays to when they actually use the church. So it's always used. People are very specific if they want to be married there or have their funeral or a special occasion in the church basement. So it is a big part of the community. It's just not a central point at this point.
That's great. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, Golden Ray, give us the saga. Give us, a quick kind of up to date, and then what's going on right now and what are the problems.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, the Golden Ray is a capsized cargo ship, specifically cars. It's called row boat. So roll on, roll off. You drive these cars on and you drive them off. And 2019, September 8th, it actually capsized, and in the St. Simon Sound. It capsized whole, but it was damaged enough where it couldn't be refloated. Well, a year and a half, it's still there. And the way they decide to cut it up is to chop it like a loaf of bread. So if you have the ship, they made it into 8 sections, and the sections are designed or measured as if they will fit onto a barge as large as you can, because the cuts take a long time no matter how you do it. And it just so happens that these cuts are taking longer than they have ever anticipated. There are problems after problems. So far they have removed 3 sections. 2 of them have already been shipped down and around to Louisiana. The 3rd section is sitting at our port in Brunswick. It's called sea fasten. So basically welded to the ship, securing it, pulling out some of the cars that are just hanging there. So it's not a hazard when they actually go around the Keys or in the Gulf of Mexico with all the other traffic that's there. So basically to prevent any more pollution or contamination to any waters. So that's still there. They're getting close to sending that off to Louisiana. So that will be 3 sections. And they are currently trying to get the chain into a groove that they've already created, what's called their section 7, which is the engine room. This is a very cautious, I'll say, section, because they have these fuel tunnels, pipes, leading to the engine room. All the pipes within the ship are leading to this engine room. When the ship, let me back up a little bit. When the ship first capsized, there was around 380,000 gallons of bunker fuel, which is a thick oil. It's putrid, it's nasty, it's thicker than our oil you put in your car. It's almost goo. And they were able to lighter, which means pull out 320,000 gallons, which is great. But that means there's still 44,000 gallons left on board. But also that if you do the math quick, but I've already done the math, otherwise I wouldn't have done it that quick. There's 16,000 gallons still missing. And that was the 16,000 gallons that actually leaked out into our estuaries and our beaches in September and October of 2019. And that was devastating. It impacted over 30 miles of the estuary. And that was just a fraction of this 44,000 gallons. So we are watching like a hawk. We're constantly monitoring the beaches, the estuaries, looking for any oil that leaks out, because there are small leaks, but also picking up car parts. Because when the chain cuts through the ship, it's non-discriminatory. So it cuts through the cars. There's 4,200 cars on there. So they cut through the cars. They cut through the floors. There's, 12, 13 floors. And so all of this stuff turns into small pieces of debris that is washing up. And it has so far washed further south is Cumberland Island, the north end of Cumberland. And then furthest north hasn't reached Sapelo, but it's basically one island just south of there. It's called Little Egg Island Bar. So it's pretty much a sandbar right before it reaches Sapelo Island. And that's north and south. The furthest west goes all the way underneath Highway 17 to what's called Blythe Island. And that is the port where the ship actually originally left. So that's 9 miles as if you're on a boat. So it's a wide berth of contaminants. And this cut is really making us sweat.
What's the strategy for containing all that oil or sludge or whatever?
Yeah, well, if it floats, it's better to get, because you can see it. It's pretty neat to see the operation going on. They're definitely having around a dozen boats. They're called support boats, and they have these things off the back of them or to the side. They're called booms, and what they do is they float on the water, and they actually only absorb the contaminants, your floating contaminants. And then also they have a helicopter flying over when there's a large release. And that is good because when you're on the water and if you have any type of chop or any type of waves, you just can't see it unless you're in it. And then it's kind of hard to react to see how far it's stretching. And so a
Right.
helicopter really directs the boats of where to go, when to go. And so that is good, but that is only for your floating contaminants. Bunker fuel can have different types of weights because the weights that's actually used is before it's actually used in the ship, it's actually heated up to become liquid.
Hmm.
And so before that, it can float in your mid column. And so at that point, it could either wash up somewhere in our estuary, which is our nursery for our shrimp,
Right.
oyster beds, or redfish. So many different types of animals use this area, but also it could float out to sea and hit Sapelo or Cumberland. We
Yeah.
don't know. We don't know. So it's a guessing game. There are crews here to clean up, and I do talk to them often, whether I run to them on the beach or whether I call them on their cell phones. They know that I'm there for clean water, and I'm not there to make them look bad or anything like that. I want to work with them
Yeah.
so we end up with our environment that we started off with.
Yeah.
Um, we know that is a very far-fetched goal because it is so messy and some of the contaminants are just hard to get. But that is our goal.
Yeah.
We are pretty tough with it, and they know now that's my goal. And so when I call, they answer. And I have the Coast Guard, I have the mitigation team. I have pretty much everybody's number, and I try to be fair, and I think they're fair with me too.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're trying to keep it a working relationship, but also they know where I stand.
Yeah. So we are at the end of March,
Yeah,
coming into April. We're not too terribly far away from storm season.
yeah,
And so I know that originally, when this cleanup was to happen, the goal was to get it cleaned up so that it wouldn't be sitting out there when hurricanes decide to come this way. And so, what dangers does it pose if it's not gone when hurricanes begin to roll into this part of Georgia?
right. So high winds are just dangerous because we have cranes out there, but also the ship that they're using is actually a catamaran that straddles the actual Golden Ray,
Hmm.
and it's called almost like these golden arches, and that's where they have the chains that run underneath the ship and saw. It's not fast, but it does this.
Yeah.
And it's really tall also, so high winds with such tall machinery is dangerous. And the ship itself, these middle sections, they're they are technically unstable, but also they're also heavily dug into the sand and the mud at this point because the
Right.
ship is actually sitting on the sandbar, and it's completely open on both ends, so you have your water transferring in and out. But as you know, on the coast, not only does the water move, your sand and your mud moves too, so your middle sections are very secured within that mud, but the top sections could have
Sure.
collapsing issues too, because that has actually been seen in the other two ships that were done throughout the world. And those middle sections just collapsed because you took your most stable ends off. And so it becomes more flimsy. You're losing
Sure.
structural stability. And so they do have stability monitors on top and on the sides of the ship to monitor that for everyone's safety. And so far, it seems to be quite stable, even when they're cutting. But they know that's always a possibility, and that's one thing that they are monitoring.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, thank you for your work on always monitoring the golden array and picking up stuff off the beach and in the water. Um, Obviously, the same problem, but very different category is microplastics and
Yeah.
plastics generally. I mean, obviously, you're cleaning up stuff off the boat, but a ton of our communities are always concerned about plastics and microplastics. And I know that that's a lot of what you work on as well. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is something again that it's in every community, and it's what every municipality is actually dealing with because they see it in their water. It's something that they are trying to also combat. to have special filters and, have the best water quality. That's always a competition for them. So it's good to see. It's a nice, healthy competition. But here on the coast, we actually see it in their ocean waters. And I started working with UGA, Merrick's, and Skidaway Institute of Oceanography up in Savannah, and also a few other river keepers, Ogeechee River Keeper, Savannah River Keeper, and then also the Satilla River Keeper. So we have this basically a snapshot of what our coast looks like in microplastics. There's different types of microplastics. It's everything from, when your plastic gets really brittle and breaks apart. So there's the fragments, but there's also your styrofoam when that breaks into those small beads. There's that type of plastic. And then there's plastic before it's plastic. And it has a funny name. They're called nurdles. And they're basically tiny beads that get melted together to get your bottles or your containers. And because they're easy to transport, they can be specifically modified to a specific color or thickness. So it depends on what the companies want. They can actually, create. But what happens is these products or these noodles actually get shipped in containers, and they at times fall off ships. And then you have a huge, basically these tiny beads everywhere, all over your beaches. And it's almost an impossible task to clean up. And also too, around plastic companies that are close to rivers, they have spills too. Accidents happen, but how are we better prepared to clean these up, especially at something that's so small? Microplastic is considered anything a mustard seed size or smaller. So how do you properly clean that up? It's almost impossible. And so to have the monitoring system that Merrick's and SKIO has set up, and the river keepers are working, we can get a better handle of hotspots, or whether it's times of the year that are hotspots. And that's something that they saw for the past 2 years of this program's been going on, is that, there's hotspots typically around cities, but what is more eye-opening is that the summertime is a higher time to find microplastics. And that makes sense because we typically as humans go to the beaches. And so one other type of plastic that we find that we mainly find is called microfibers. So that's everything that's coming from our clothes, which is incredibly interesting to realize that our clothes are creating problems. And that is everything from drying our clothes to washing our clothes to even just our swimsuits and stuff we bring to the beach that leaves, product behind. So it's just this kind of this eye-opening experience to see what's going on. And but also it's almost interesting to compare Georgia to other states too. How we typically just have the microfibers and not have the typical fragments or tons of styrofoam, because that's what we see in our rivers typically is when we go to the gas station, we get something to drink, and that's what it usually comes in. And sometimes you put it in the back of your truck. Well, guess what flies out? It's those light containers, or even to-go containers. When the pandemic hit, that's what you needed for these restaurants. It's very easy, and you can't slight them for that because the cost is so low. And also too, it was a benefit to have in the pandemic because you can just get rid of it. Your germs were gone. But yet that also increased the amount of plastics that we have here. And it just stays around for longer than you can ever expect.
Right. It's a reminder of how multiplying that the problem of plastics is. Everything that you do with plastics, it just is in every fabric of our environment and our bodies. And what is for coastal communities, but obviously, like you said, this is the kind of stuff that shows up in our rivers, it shows up in our lakes, it shows up in all sorts of waterways. And what are the kinds of things that communities should be doing to ensure that that is not the case?
So this is a tough thing that we as advocates struggle with, because I in no way want to add extra costs to businesses. They work too hard for this. These small businesses, they just work too hard. So you kind of start asking questions like, would it be beneficial to create a co-op where a bunch
Mm.
of businesses get together and they buy these what I call better products at a at a lower rate? But again, that has to I think that could start working in a smaller community, because it creates what is it, like storage issues,
Hmm.
yeah, and stuff like that. So that's one way to do it, of doing it. Or maybe if someone will be able to set up a website, so someone would create the storage for these businesses and they can order from that. That's one thing that we're talking about, but again, it's adding cost, but it's also giving an easy way or an easy access for the restaurants or these businesses to get these products. Because a lot of times, like the paper straws, I don't like a paper straw because they get all mushy in your drink. But yet, uh, it's such a tough thing. Uh, I like the idea of how restaurants just don't put the straws on your table
Hmm.
anymore. They're asking you, so that's helpful. Or you can move to there's other types of straws besides paper straws. So I
Yeah.
think the first products that came out were test runs, but now we just have to get these newer products that are better out to the restaurants, or just out to your mainstream, to give people an option, or to even have their customers have an option or a say
Yeah.
what they want.
I
Is
like
that
how you, sorry, I like how you talk
oh,
about the restaurants, like because you don't want them to put, these additional burdens
mhm.
on people who are already working hard and like have slim margins. But what are some, you talked about kind of the plastic before it's plastic and these other kinds of things like that. Like, are there policy opportunities to help push on some things like that that help prevent that kind of pollution and debris?
Yeah, there are policies, and Atlanta has really stepped forward in that. And the airport, surprisingly enough, they really took the lead on it. And whether it was a push for, like airlines themselves, or if it was just the Atlanta airport, it's nice. It's a really good example to start seeing how a big industry that has multiple restaurants and multiple avenues taking that step forward.
Mhm.
So they are recognizing it and they are trying to push forward. Savannah is really trying to figure these things out also. Um, but again, it's a challenge, of how to keep the businesses moving in the directions that they want without putting like your governmental forces onto them. But yet, it's a way we need to move. We just
Yeah.
don't have the recycling anymore. um, for what I don't, people may have heard this or may not have heard this, but for a long time we were actually shipping our plastic overseas.
Right.
So we were still promoting recycling, but not in the way I think people really were
Yeah.
expecting. And so that's just an interesting concept too, of like you still promote recycling, but not in the way that people really knew about. And so we just got to do better. We got to keep our mess, clean up our own mess,
Yeah.
basically, and stop shipping it somewhere else, because they reach capacity too. I mean,
Yeah. We're just kicking the problem down the road.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And yeah, and it's the population's growing. We have to just learn how to be better at growing our population and our businesses and be better. And I think we can. We have the technology. It's a struggle right now, but
Yeah.
we can do it. And as community members, we can make definitely a push for that.
So we're coming towards the end of our time, but I definitely wanted to give you some time to talk about dredging and the importance of that and the timeline that's slipping there. So I think what would be helpful is to say a little bit about what that process even is and why you all go through that process on the coast. And then, yeah, what's the problem with the timeline?
Yeah, so yeah, we have to be talking about the shipping industry quite a bit these days, which is okay because the shipping industry is important, especially in Brunswick. It is our number one employer. And I always say it's such a huge benefit and a huge opportunity for have a business that can offer paying jobs, health insurance, and they're good jobs.
Mm,
So again, we never want to stop that. But what occurs when we have these big ships and with our channels, shipping channels, is that sediment falls into it. And
mhm,
so therefore it becomes more shallow. And that's a dangerous to ships, large ships. And the Savannah actually dredges more often than the Brunswick does. And they actually deepen their harbor to allow Pan American ships, which is amazing to see. It's just so huge. But the Brunswick Channel, we don't have to dredge as often because it's actually what's called a natural channel. So, but there are times that we do need to dredge. And this season or this year was going to be one of those years. But recently, the Corps of Engineers decided to put forth a change in the dredging timeline. And the typical timeline for dredging was the winter months. So I believe November through March. And that was typically for sea turtles. Typically, they're pelagic species, which means they're ocean species. And they only come to land in the summertime to lay eggs. So it's very specific, females full of
mhm,
eggs coming to land. And they found out when they were dredging is where they take these almost like big vacuums with, it's called a cutter head, to chop up the stuff on the bottom. So mud, rocks, it pretty much takes everything and sucks it up and puts it on to another really cool ship. And then they'll take this soil and put it in a very specific location, because if you dump too much soil in one spot, you change your oxygen, your
mhm,
dissolved oxygen, and you can kill your fish or anything that's around. So they do it very specifically, very scientifically in specific areas, whether it's out at sea or in Brunswick, we have this area called Bird Island. It's a dredge island, and it now houses over 10,000 nesting terns, over 500 nesting brown pelicans, and it's an amazing area that now the birds have taken advantage of. And so it is an advantage. It's an advantage to the shipping industry. We can get our ships in and out, but also we have advantages for birds and stuff like that. But the Corps of Engineers is changing the timeline. They're opening up dredging to actually dredge year round, which means
mm,
they're going to be sucking up these female sea turtles that are coming to land to lay their eggs. And sometimes, if they miss the dredging once, sometimes they come up to land 4 times. They sometimes will come to land and decide not to lay their net, lay
mhm.
their eggs, and so they'll go back out and come back in. And this is really dangerous for the sea turtles.
Yeah.
And the idea behind changing the timeline and opening up all year is to decrease the interaction with right whales. Well, we've had one close incident, which is called a take, um, in the past. I think it's since '94, and the whale was not injured, and nor was it killed. But it was considered a take because if you disturb a
Mhm.
whale, it's not good.
Yeah.
And so that was the reasoning to change it. But it does not benefit the sea turtles here. And so we are highly concerned about what it's going to do to our sea turtle population. The state and private islands have been working, 30 plus years to bring these species back, to bring the species
Mm,
back from extinction. And it's such a blow to the coast. And the sad thing is, it was the comment period just closed yesterday, but the contracts for the dredgers have already been signed. They've already
mm,
been accepted. So we're not sure what the state is going to do with all the public comments, because the Corps of Engineers has already assigned the contracts.
wow.
Yeah. So it's going to be a huge hit to the sea turtle program in the state of Georgia. But uh, I don't know. We're trying to stop it, but it's we don't know. It's pretty
Yeah,
nerve wracking. Yeah, it's a
yeah.
lot of hard work too. In the middle of the summer, people are working on these islands to dig the sea turtle nests, to move them. The sea turtles are already getting a hit from the land that they're losing due to sea level rise, and just our barrier islands are protecting our mainland
Mm.
for a very specific reason, for erosion and a few other aspects. And so, but the sea turtles take advantage of this land, and what's not developed is nesting territory for them. They
Yeah,
don't understand. And it's interesting too. You think, oh, like dredgers, um, their ships, they're not quiet. They're not quiet at all. They're super noisy. So you think if an animal's coming up to a super noisy ship, they just go away. Sea turtles don't really care, or they like the dredge material. Sometimes when you mix up your bottom of your river, it turns warm.
hmm,
That has all the detritus. And so they really like that. And also another experience, or another theory that why sea turtles get sucked up in these dredges is that um, they can feel the vibration of the cutter heads. And so instead of swimming away, they'll actually dig down into the mud or the dirt that's on the bottom. And that's how they get sucked up. That's just something that they don't really know why
yeah,
so many sea turtles are get sucked up. Like, why don't they go away from this noise and the vibration? So some people think it's the heat, because they like that. They're a reptile. They like the temperature, when it warms up a little bit. But also it could be they're just trying to hide.
yeah,
Don't know. Our water, we can't see anything underneath it. We can
yeah.
barely see a foot, in front of our face. But also, the dredgers, they don't want to suck up sea turtles. Like, they're human. They don't
Right.
want animals on their ship. And but yet it's also, they're doing a very important job.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not
it's a
easy.
necessity. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so we're just really disappointed in the Corps of Engineers pushing this through, and why they're changing it all of a sudden. And we know for a fact that in Brunswick, it's not an emergency to deepen the channel, because the Golden Ray, when that capsized, one of the theories was, well, maybe it ran aground. Maybe it
Hmm.
hit something that we didn't know was there. But so they did river surveys, and they found nothing out of the ordinary. They found a good depth throughout the
Hmm.
channel that they travel in. And so the Brunswick Channel doesn't have that need. The Savannah Channel constantly gets maintenance dredging. So they again don't have that emergency need to go through the summer.
Hmm.
And so again, as an advocate for, all animals, multi-species, we just don't see the need for the change, and
Yeah.
we actually see harm
Yeah.
with this change. Yeah.
Well, Susan, thank you for your work and thank you for keeping us all updated. If you're watching, if you're on the coast, if you want to get involved with Altamaha Riverkeeper, definitely get in touch with Susan and start to do some of this important work on the coast. Thank you so much for coming on this morning. I
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Corey. Yeah, hopefully I didn't talk your ear off too much.
No, this was great. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for this episode.